the intersection of nonfiction writing and fiction writing is a lot closer than you might think. In fact, we could all learn from each other. I consider it's like cross training. You can do cardio, you can do weights, and one helps the other. And just like for working out, it helps writing as well, because we can learn fiction techniques in our nonfiction books. I like to refer to, say, case studies as really, they're short stories, but how can we add more life to them? How can we make sure that we're showing and not just telling, so people can really understand and get the emotional impact, as well as understand it on an emotional, visceral level, as well as an intellectual level. In fact, when I work with my clients, I use that exact example, because people don't remember your points unless there's a story attached to it. That's why story is so important. The story is what people remember, and then they remember the moral or the point of your story. So today, we're going to learn more about how to make that happen so we can connect more with our readers. Our guest today is Kathy Norris. She's a novelist whose works are about the coming of age during the civil rights and feminist movies in the 1970s. Her stories have appeared in 3 anthologies. She hosts a podcast, the Quill and the Quantum AI Writing Craft, on the Authors On Air Global Network. The Quill and Quantum explores the intersection of AI and the craft of writing, and she just interviewed me on that, and it was a lot of fun. She's also a member and has served on the board of directors of the Sisters in Crime Los Angeles chapter, which is a professional development and advancement group that helps women crime fiction. Men can join too, as I've learned when I attended conferences. They said, no, you can join too. It's all right. So it's cool. Kathy was born and raised in Los Angeles, and as the children of educators, she fell in love with reading at an early age. And when she read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye as a freshman in Wellesley, her life was transformed because she recognized her own story in print. And the feminist movement of the early 70s led Kathy to a fascination with powerful women. Her works, whether in short story or novel format, tend to center on strong women of color. So thank you very much for joining us, Kathy. We can't wait to hear the great information you have to share for us.
Thank you so much, Dan, for inviting me to your group. What a breadth of expertise there is here today. This is wonderful. It makes it so much easier to talk about the points that I wanted to make, that I've been thinking about ever since Dan and I started talking about what techniques in fiction translate into nonfiction. And I came up with an acronym that doesn't really quite work, but I'm sticking to it because it starts off so well. And the acronym is SAVED. S being for storytelling, of course. I think since man sat around the campfire telling stories to one another, there is just something in our DNA that is attracted to stories, and we gravitate to them. It's a way of passing on knowledge from one person to another. So any part of your writing that you can narrate in the form of a story, I think engages the reader. The second is anecdotes. A dry recitation of facts is boring, as you all know. But an anecdote where you take your personal experience or that of someone else and use it to make a point that you need to make in your work, it is a 1-2 punch. The third is the letter V for vivid descriptions. Dan talked a little bit earlier about showing, not telling, and that's an old war horse that sometimes has been beaten to death, but stays relevant today to the extent that you can show instead of tell. For example, if I was to say, Dan has black eyes and eyebrows, there's one thing. But if I was to say, Dan had the winged eyebrows of an eagle, yes, and the nose of a falcon, immediately that is so much more vivid and rich than just saying that, Dan has black eyes and black eyebrows. And this is something that in the work that you do. Now we come to the letter.
Not. And maybe not to that extent. So yeah, I just picked up a good tip there that you got the eyebrows, and like there were similes, there were yeah, it was just beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yes. So yes, we're trying to show Dan, not just tell about Dan. And then we come to E, which was a real struggle, fellow authors, in coming up with a word. It's going to stand for character development. Why? Because there's an E in both character, the word character, and the word development. But to the extent that you are bringing to the page characters, even if it is nonfiction, again, we're human beings, we relate to one another. It's another entry point to snag your reader if you can draw that connection between them and the character. And then finally, dialogue. Boy, did I learn the hard way the importance of dialogue. When I first thought I wanted to be a writer, I thought, how hard can it be? I love to read. So, I'll get this done in a snap. And one thing that I learned is that a page after page after page of solid Black writing is a turnoff, but dialogue can be used to tell your reader about your characters and to move your pace forward. And I think for that reason, it is pivotal. So that's the origins of the acronym SAVED. As I said, it doesn't quite work the way I want it to, but give me time, ladies and gentlemen. I will find an E that discusses character development.
Great. I love the idea of dialogue. I was working with one of my clients recently, and he started a chapter. I said, "You need a story to start the chapter." He said, "Great." So he wrote a story that basically said, this scene plays out in corporate boardrooms all the time. The senior VP of goes in there and tells them they need to do X, Y, and Z, and they either do it or they don't do it. And I said, okay, yeah, the bones of a story here. What did he actually say? What did the board members say in return? How did the dialogue go? And then what was happened? He said, oh, now we have a scene. So dialogue made it real, as opposed to saying, so I think a lot of writers, especially nonfiction writers, think that just by telling that little anecdote, here's what I saw, here's what my client did, it falls flat, or it's not as vivid as you say. But by adding the dialogue, now we're transported into the scene and we're part of the scene and we understand what's going on. So thank you so much for coming up with that wonderful acronym. And you and I will work together on finding out a E that works with character development. So great. Can you give us some examples or some fiction techniques or an example of narrative elements?
Certainly, when we're talking about narrative elements, and all of the writers in this group know what I'm talking about, setting, characters, plot, theme. What have I left out? Did I say conflict? How could I forget conflict? Where would we be without conflict? These are all narrative themes that you can bring into your nonfiction work to engage the reader. And I thought, oh, we're welcoming a new person, it would appear. Greetings. These are all narrative themes, narrative elements that you can bring to bear in your writing, again, with the goal of engaging your reader. And Dan, if it was okay with you, I had bought a case study to discuss with your group that shows some of these elements. I'm referring to a book that's called What Am I Going to Do All Day? That's by Dr. Patrice Jenkins. And basically, it's a guide for people who are retiring or hesitating to retire because they don't know what they're going to do all day. It is a nonfiction book. But I want to read from you the first 3 paragraphs from the introduction. It should not take long, just as a way of illustrating how this particular author has used all of these techniques in her nonfiction book. Introduction. As Fred made the first cut into his retirement cake, he leaned over to his supervisor and said, "Bob, I don't know what in hell I'm doing." Bob took the knife from his hand and said, "Come with me." They went to Bob's office, where Fred explained he wasn't ready to retire. And I quote, "Up to this moment, I've been going through the motions of retirement. It seemed like the next thing to do. My children are grown. My wife and I sold our house since we don't need 5 bedrooms. I'm 57. Retirement felt like the next thing on the list, but the truth is I'm not ready. It's not about the money. I have that figured out. What's really bothering me is I have no idea what I will do with myself all day. End of quote. And what I love about these paragraphs, these 2 paragraphs, is that we get everything all in one punch. We get the setting, a retirement party. We have a retirement cake. We've got character development. We know an awful lot about Bob. We know his age. We know his marital status. We know what kind of job he held. We know what some of his deepest and darkest fears are, just in a matter of 2 paragraphs. We've got dialogue. We have dialogue from the opening sentence. And I think it's one of the things that makes this one paragraph so powerful. Dialogue from almost the very, very beginning. And those rich visual images, a knife slicing into a cake. You can it's a word picture. You can't help but not see that when it's written so well. And the conflict between the external trappings of a celebratory event like this retirement party and the inner conflict of someone who is afraid of retirement. And so I thought, as I was getting ready for this presentation, for this discussion, I thought, wow, it captures everything that I'm talking about in this one first page section. Any feedback or comments from that? I don't mean to just talk the entire time.
Sure. I'm glad. I was amazed and impressed by what was not there.
Ah,
And that is the extraneous use of dialogue tag adjectives. Bob said expressively. Bob said pensively. Bob looked with a quizzical look in his eye. We don't need that. And a lot of times writers do put all those extraneous words in there when the dialogue and the words themselves should express the feeling and the emotion. And I think your author did it very, very well. So I thought that was great. When I work with my clients, we start with a little anecdote like that, and then we make the point and we transition to, so the moral of the story is, the point of the story is this. Now we can go into the deeper discussion about, why this is important and what to look out for and coaching questions and other things that they really want to get off their chest. So they come up with these anecdotes. Kathy, when you do this kind of work, how do you get those kind of anecdotes out of people? And how do you get that dialogue out of people?
well, for me, it's a matter of rewriting. My first draft is usually all telling. I'll be honest with you. It's all telling, and I'm feeling my way through the work, through the chapter, trying to get to identify what I'm trying to say, which, by the way, I have to add here is one of the things that makes writing so much different for a human being as opposed to AI. We are writing to discover what we think and what we feel about something, as opposed to AI, which is, generating a response to a query. But for me, writing is a way of exploring and fine-tuning and understanding what it is that I think, and therefore what my characters are thinking and doing. And Dan, what was the second part of your question?
I don't remember.
Ah,
How do you create that dialogue? I mean, you're
Oh,
creating it
so
from your head. As we're creating it by interviewing our subject matter experts. So how do you vividly think of dialogue that works?
well, after I've gone through the initial first draft, and for me, writing really is a process of rewriting, given the number of drafts that I do. I start to, as my characters take shape, I'm reading for pace and realizing that things are kind of slow. And that's when I usually turn to dialogue. Because as I said, dialogue for me is a great way of picking up the pace. Let's get going. Especially if I have a scene with a lot of conflict and as a way that, and I'm using dialogue to further define the characters and engaging their different points of view. That's when I usually am turning to dialogue near the end. Conversely, I've just told you I use it near the end after lots of rewriting, but there are times when I sit down at my writing desk and there's a phrase or a sentence or something that's just in my mind and I've got to get it out. And so I will sit down and I will just start with the dialogue. I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what the point is. It's just that this character that I have developed over time has something to say, and I need to say it. And I'll figure it all out later on where it fits. But I just have to, the character is insistent. And that's when I know that I have done a passable job of character development, when they're knocking on my skull and saying, I've got something to say. I've got something to say. And then I go, okay, here, I'm going to sit down and I'll let you say it. It may not make it to the final cut, but I'll let you say what you need to say.
Very interesting. I like your, I want to go deeper into the idea of pacing. How do you know when the pacing is good or bad or needs to move up? Is that just internal? You have this gut feel, or
And that's a wonderful question. And I owe it all, what pacing there is in my work, I owe it all to my writing group, where we meet every Saturday. This group meets and we all have to bring 10 new pages. And we read our work aloud to each other. And that is one of the best ways I know of determining the pacing in your work. If it feels slow and stumbly in the reading, I know I've got to go back. And sure enough, my fellow, writers will say, Kathy, boy, did that drag. You really need to, oh, no, we're brutally honest. After all this time, we are brutally honest. No punches pulled. The pacing is too slow. You need to do something to move it along, move it on, because this is dragging. But even in the reading aloud, I think you hear it yourself. I find myself thinking as I'm reading, boy, am I still talking about this? It's time for me to have moved on.
interesting. So feedback from other people. When you read the stories yourself, do you get the internal feeling like this is kind of slow, I need to put dialogue in here? Or does this come with your skill as a writer, your experience as a writer, you've been doing this for a very long time? It's like internal to you that it just, you know what to do?
Oh, yes, I know exactly what to do. There are certain things that I think we as writers and authors internalize over time. When we recognize a flaw in our work, I think we know how to go about changing it. Is it a problem with the plot? Is it a problem with the pacing? Is it a problem with, this specific scene? Am I not really clear about what the character needs to say? All of this, I find if I go to sleep with all of this on thinking about these issues, usually when I wake up in the morning, I might have a potential solution. That's been my process, at least.
Well, I'm glad you wake up in the morning. I wake up at 3 in the morning and then I can't get back to sleep. And if that happens, turn the light on and write something on a paper or pull out your iPhone so so you can review it in the morning and see if it still makes sense. Before I turn the light on, I would just scribble something, and in the morning I'd like, I can't even read this. So pro tip.
And I have to definitely endorse that. I had a brilliant idea in the middle of the night that was so brilliant, so, earth-shakingly, fabulous, this idea, that I knew I didn't need to write it down, because how could I forget such a brilliant idea that woke me in the middle of the night? Of course, you know how this story ends. I forgot it. And I've been kicking myself to this day, wondering what was that brilliant idea years ago now that I failed to write down at the correct time.
Hey, what other techniques do fiction writers use to make stories come alive that we can use in our nonfiction books?
Well, we haven't spoken a great deal about character development, and normally that's a big deal in fiction, and you might be thinking not so much in nonfiction. But I will say one thing I noticed in What Will I Do All Day is each chapter the author has created two characters that have a different experience when it comes to retirement, one positive, one negative. And because we're looking at the retirement experience through the characters, it makes it very relatable and very interesting. So I think character development is another one of those narrative elements that can work well in nonfiction if you've got that kind of a setup. If you use characters throughout your work to make your point, as Patrice Jenkins does.
What are some tips for creating a character that is believable? And what are some errors that people make in creating characters that are just not relatable or realistic or just fall flat?
Oh, for me, speaking for me, if the character makes me uncomfortable, I know I'm on the right path. If the character is oatmeal and there's no conflict, I mean, there's no conflict, but I wrote a short story involving the anti-Kathy, because, this character was mean, incredibly assertive, rude, everything that I like to think that I'm not. And just writing about this character was made me very, very uncomfortable. But she leaps from the page. She's a fire investigator for a California fire department. She leaps from the page. She does all the things that you're not supposed to do. And that for me was a wake-up call and people who read the work want more of her. Is she coming back? Are you going to bring that character back in another short story? This is a short story character, by the way. And I can't believe how often I get that question. People love her because she's real and she's fierce and she's fabulous. And as I said, she made me uncomfortable. So now when I'm writing, I don't shy away and I don't, clean up the character anymore. I just put that character out there on the page. And what's that phrase? Devil hang the hindmost. Just put it out there and leave it.
Right. What are some mistakes that people make when they create their characters?
Oh, the exact opposite. They create boring characters it's, you know what, Dan, it's not so much the characters, because the characters are usually for me at least, are going to come through the plot. There's not enough conflict. If the work is dull, there's usually not enough conflict. And the way to spice up the characters, perhaps to spice up the conflict. You guys may or may not remember a TV show called, was it Chorus, or it was about a high school,
Glee?
Glee. Thank you very much. It was Glee. And this may be an urban myth, but I was told that when it came to getting Glee approved, one of the things that the producers insisted on, or the editors insisted on, they said, you have no villain. You have no villain in this initial draft. And that's what's missing there. So there was no evil phys ed teacher who was so brilliantly portrayed by the actress whose name I no longer recall.
Jane
But
Lynn.
yeah, she was written, yes. So that part was written in because there wasn't enough conflict. And see, it didn't start with the character. The intensity started with the conflict that she brought to the series.
Sure. And when we do our case studies, the conflict is sort of inherent. Company had this problem. They tried all these solutions. It didn't work. They brought me in and I proposed this, and they initially had some feedback that, this won't work here, whatever. And I convinced them and they tried it. And then 3 months later, it was wonderful. And we have a quote saying, this worked, Dan is great. Very simple format. How can we spice that up?
How do we spice up the format or the conflict? How do we spice up conflict?
I gave you the outline of a typical case study. I'm guessing we can spice it up with this, having dialogue. He said this, I said that. I said, "You're sure it can work?" Blah, blah, blah. That would be one idea. Would you describe the characters, with the hawk-like nose and the balding head? No, whatever. Is that relevant, or is that that would just add so much more spice to what would normally be an okay story? Would that elevate it to a higher level?
Oh, Dan, I just consider that prudent character development. The eagle eyes and the hooked nose and the rest of it. It's a good question. I think in listening to the background of this group, I'm particularly fascinated with this concept of writing manuals, because that seems to me to be perhaps one of the best examples of needing of conflict free. Or am I wrong? Those of you who write how-to manuals, do you find that to be the case?
We'll take questions later. Thank you.
So,
Sorry.
so in other words, I'm thinking that it's the nature of the work that develops the conflict. If I was writing a manual, a how-to book, perhaps I could engage or create characters, one who's doing it the right way, one who's doing it the wrong way, and having some sort of dialogue between the two of them, these little vignettes sprinkled throughout, sort of like the old-fashioned Kathy can do. And it says, always wear your protective lenses when you're in the workshop, that kind of thing, as opposed to, Devin never does, who, the bad character who's always flouting the rules. That's what comes to me off the top of my head, Dan.
Okay, great. Are there any other key points you'd like to share with us?
Mainly that, to my surprise, the techniques that I spent so much time developing in my fiction writing translate very easily into nonfiction. This surprised me, Dan. I did not, when we were talking about this the other day, I thought, oh, it's a totally different world, but it's not. It's not. Good writing is good writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. It engages the reader, and to the point, and to the extent that you've engaged that reader, then you're going to get your message across, your theme. Your theme is going to get across.
Great. Kathy, how can people learn more about you and read your books and your short stories?
They can go to kathyanorris.com, where you will find a complete list of my podcasts and the books that I've written.
Great. Thanks for being with us today. And thanks everyone for listening. There are more than 200 other videos on how to write your book in a flash on YouTube. Check them out.